The blood on the marble floor didn't bother Valentina as much as the silence of the men who spilled it, yet she kept her head down, scrubbing the stains until her knuckles turned white. It was 3 in the morning at the Black Diamond Casino, a time when the powerful Chicago elite vanished and the ghosts took over, but the rhythmic sound of her brush stopped when she realized her 5-year-old daughter wasn't at her side. Fear, sharp and cold as an ice pick, pierced her chest while she followed the faint trail of Mia's footsteps toward the forbidden steel doors of the basement. She pushed into the dark, expecting a reprimand, but instead found her tiny daughter standing over a man chained to the wall like a common animal. It was Nathaniel Corsetti, the sovereign of the Chicago outfit, his face a mask of bruises and dried gore, looking less like a king and more like a sacrificial lamb. Valentina's heart hammered against her ribs as she saw the heavy iron links cutting into his wrists, yet Mia didn't scream. She simply reached out a small, trembling hand to touch the monster's cheek. "Does it hurt?" the child whispered into the suffocating gloom. "Are you crying, mister?" Valentina froze, knowing that seeing a mafia boss in his moment of absolute humiliation was a death sentence. Yet as Nathaniel's dark, predatory eyes snapped open to meet hers, she realized the true nightmare hadn't even begun. The air in the basement felt thick with the copper tang of blood and the damp scent of mildew, but the sudden, heavy thud of boots on the floorboards directly above shattered the paralyzing silence. Valentina knew that sound. It was the rhythmic, arrogant stride of men who didn't care about the noise they made because they owned the night. Silas Fane's hit squad was coming back to finish what they'd started, yet Valentina found herself moving before her mind could even process the suicide mission she was embarking on. She lunged forward, snatching Mia back and pressing a finger to the girl's lips while her other hand fumbled for the bobby pin tucked into her messy bun. Nathaniel's breathing was a ragged, wet whistle in the dark, but his eyes followed her every move with a terrifying intensity that suggested he was already calculating how to kill her if he got free. "Don't scream," she hissed, her voice barely a thread of sound as she jammed the wire into the industrial lock of the iron shackles. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the pin, but the memory of her father's unpaid gambling debts and the ruthlessness of the men upstairs provided a desperate sort of clarity. The lock clicked with a metallic snap that sounded like a gunshot in the cramped space, and Nathaniel's heavy frame slumped forward, his dead weight nearly crushing Valentina to the floor. She struggled to keep him upright, her muscles screaming under the pressure of his massive build, while Mia gripped the hem of her mother's uniform with wide, fearful eyes. They didn't have time for the stairs, but Valentina had spent 3 years cleaning every hidden crevice of this building and knew the laundry chutes were the only way out for a ghost. She dragged the half-conscious mafia boss toward the heavy steel hatch of the service tunnel, pushing him inside the narrow, linen-slicked slide just as the basement door above groaned open. "Go, Mia. Slide down and don't make a sound until you see the rain," she whispered, shoving her daughter after the fallen king before tumbling into the darkness herself. The descent was a blur of rough metal and the smell of stale detergent, but they hit the bottom of the bin in the alleyway with a jarring impact that knocked the wind from her lungs. Outside, the Chicago sky was weeping a freezing November sleet, the ice stinging Valentina's face as she hauled Nathaniel out of the bin and toward the shadows of the neighboring tenements. Behind them, the casino basement erupted in a chaotic chorus of shouts and the rhythmic thunder of high-caliber gunfire, proving that Silas Fane didn't take kindly to his prize being stolen. Valentina's breath came in ragged gasps that turned to mist in the freezing air, but she didn't stop until they were deep within the labyrinth of the forgotten slums where the police never ventured. She looked down at her hands, stained with the blood of a man who could either save her family or destroy it with a single word, and realized she had just traded her invisibility for a target on her back. Nathaniel's fingers suddenly clamped around her wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a dying man, his gaze burning through the shadows. "Why?" he rasped, the single word dripping with a dark, predatory curiosity that made her skin crawl. Valentina didn't have an answer that made sense, yet as she looked at her shivering daughter and then back at the monster she'd just rescued, she knew the debt she had just created would be paid in more than just silver. The safe house smelled of wet concrete and decades of rot, but to Valentina, it was the only sanctuary left in a city that had suddenly turned into a hunting ground. She had spent the last 4 hours tending to Nathaniel's wounds with a rusted first aid kit and melted snow, watching the way his jaw remained clamped shut even as she pulled glass shards from his skin. He didn't look like a king anymore, stripped down to his undershirt and shivering beneath a tattered wool blanket, yet the predatory sharpness in his eyes never wavered as he watched her move. Mia was asleep in the corner on a pile of empty burlap sacks, her chest wheezing with a familiar, terrifying rattle that signaled a coming flare-up. Valentina's heart ached with every labored breath her daughter took, while she sat across from the man she'd saved, wondering if he was waiting for her to fall asleep so he could eliminate the only witness to his defeat. The tension was a living thing, thick and suffocating, broken only by the sudden, heavy thrum of black SUVs pulling into the gravel lot outside. Valentina lunged for Mia, her instinct to run screaming in her ears, but Nathaniel's hand shot out with viper-like speed, pinning her wrist to the floor with a strength that defied his battered condition. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice no longer a rasp but a cold, resonant blade that promised violence to anyone who dared cross the threshold. The door was kicked open by men in tactical gear, their rifles sweeping the room with lethal efficiency until they landed on the man sitting on the floor. Within seconds, the derelict room was flooded with the sterile authority of the Corsetti Empire, yet the atmosphere didn't grow safer. It grew infinitely more dangerous. Nathaniel stood up, swaying slightly as his second-in-command draped a heavy overcoat over his shoulders, effectively erasing the vulnerable man Valentina had dragged through the sewers. He didn't offer a word of thanks. Instead, he gestured toward a man holding a tablet, his eyes fixed on Valentina with a chilling, detached curiosity. "Valentina Mendez," Nathaniel began, the syllables of her name sounding like a sentence coming from his lips. "Daughter of Ricardo Mendez, a man who owes my casino $250,000 in gambling debts he can't pay." He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, his shadow swallowing her small frame while he looked down at her with a mask of absolute indifference. "I've just purchased that debt. But since your father's incompetence required me to be rescued by a cleaning lady, I've decided to adjust the balance for the inconvenience. You now owe the Corsetti family $750,000. Valentina felt the air leave her lungs as if she'd been struck in the solar plexus, her mind reeling at the impossible figure. "I saved your life," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Yet Nathaniel didn't flinch, his expression remaining as hard as the Chicago winter. "You saw me in chains, Valentina. In my world, that's a debt you can never truly repay with your life, so I'm giving you a chance to pay it with your service instead." He leaned in closer, the scent of expensive tobacco and iron clinging to him, and lowered his voice so only she could hear the lethal edge beneath his words. "You will move into my estate tonight. You'll be my personal housekeeper, where I can keep you under my roof and under my thumb. If you refuse, or if you try to run, I'll hand your father over to the collectors who've been looking for him, and I'll make sure your daughter's medical files are blacklisted from every hospital in this city." He paused, letting the weight of the threat settle into her bones like lead. "Do we have an understanding, or do I need to let Silas Vane find out where you're hiding?" Valentina looked at Mia's pale, sleeping face and then back at the monster who had just turned her act of mercy into a permanent shackle. She had no choice, no escape, and as she nodded her silent surrender, she realized she hadn't saved a man in that basement. She had invited the devil to claim her soul. The iron gates of the Corsetti estate groaned shut behind the black sedan, a sound that resonated like the locking of a tomb as Valentina pressed Mia's face into her shoulder to shield her from the sight of the armed guards patrolling the perimeter. The mansion loomed over the Chicago skyline like a limestone fortress, dripping with an opulence that felt cold and sterile, a sharp contrast to the cramped, warm apartment they'd been dragged from. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of beeswax and old money, but the silence was the most oppressive part, broken only by the sharp click of Valentina's worn shoes against the marble floors she was now expected to polish. She was given a uniform that fit like a second skin, a dark, heavy fabric that felt like a brand, while Mia was ushered into a small, sunless room adjoining the servants' quarters. Valentina quickly learned that the household was a minefield of unspoken rules and lethal hierarchies, where a misplaced word to the wrong lieutenant could result in a permanent disappearance. She spent her first few days moving through the halls like a shadow, her hands raw from scrubbing silver, yet her eyes remained wide and observant, cataloging every exit, every camera, and every mood swing of the man who owned her soul. Nathaniel was rarely seen, yet his presence saturated every room like a gathering storm, a constant reminder that her life was a line item on his balance sheet. One gray afternoon, Valentina was ordered to serve tea on the stone veranda overlooking the rear courtyard, where the frost still clung to the dormant rosebushes. She approached with a trembling tray, but as she reached the table, she noticed a man kneeling on the cobblestones, his hands bound behind his back and his face a mask of weeping terror. It was the estate's sous chef, a man who had offered Mia a piece of chocolate just the day before, now shivering under the cold gaze of Nathaniel Corsetti. "I don't care about the money, Alberto," Nathaniel said, his voice terrifyingly calm as he stirred a spoonful of sugar into his cup without looking up. "I care that you thought my daughter's allergy was something you could overlook for a kickback from a new supplier." Valentina froze, the porcelain cups rattling on her tray, while the chef began to plead for his life, his voice cracking with the desperation of a man who knew he was already dead. The violence happened with a clinical, sickening speed that left no room for screens. Nathaniel didn't even stand up. He simply gave a minuscule nod to the guard standing behind the kneeling man. The muffled crack of a suppressed pistol echoed through the courtyard, and the chef slumped forward, his blood staining the pristine white stones in a grotesque parody of the stains Valentina had scrubbed at the casino. Valentina's breath hitched, a wave of nausea rolling through her, yet she forced her feet to remain planted, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from Nathaniel's tea. He looked up then, his dark eyes meeting hers with a chilling lack of remorse, as if he were checking to see if his tea was hot enough rather than acknowledging the corks at his feet. "Clean that up when you're finished here, Valentina," he remarked, his tone conversational and devoid of any human heat. "And remember that in this house, there are no mistakes, only consequences." The horror of the moment settled deep in Valentina's marrow, hardening the soft parts of her heart into something jagged and sharp. She realized then that being a ghost or a servant wasn't enough to survive the orbit of a man like Nathaniel. She was a liability who knew too much, a witness to his weakness and his cruelty. If she wanted Mia to grow up in a world where she wasn't collateral damage, she couldn't just be the girl who cleaned his floors. She had to become the only person in this fortress he could actually trust, a fixture in his life so vital that he couldn't afford to let her go. As she knelt to scrub the warm blood from the courtyard stones later that evening, her knuckles turning white in the freezing air, Valentina didn't cry. She simply watched the way the red swirled into the water and made a silent vow to learn every secret, every weakness, and every rhythm of the monster in the master bedroom, until the day he realized he needed her more than she feared him. The transition from a moth-eaten cleaning uniform to a floor-length gown of midnight silk felt like a cruel joke, yet Valentina didn't complain as the stylists at the Corsetti estate cinched the corset until she could barely breathe. Nathaniel had decided that her invisibility was his greatest asset, commanding her to play the role of a distant, quiet cousin for the city's annual winter gala. a high society masquerade where the monsters of Chicago hid behind velvet masks and champagne flutes. He didn't offer her a compliment when she stepped into the foyer. Instead, he handed her a small, concealed earpiece and checked the fit of his own tuxedo with a cold, predatory focus. "You aren't there to eat or dance, Valentina," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her ear as he adjusted the silk lapels of his jacket. "You're there because people don't notice the help, and tonight, everyone is looking at me. Be my eyes in the places I can't see." The weight of the task pressed down on her more heavily than the diamonds around her neck, but as they stepped into the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel, Valentina realized the true danger wasn't the men with guns, it was the polished, smiling wolves who called themselves businessmen. The ballroom was a dizzying kaleidoscope of gold leaf and crystal, but Valentina kept her senses tuned to the fringes, moving through the crowd with the practiced grace of someone who spent years navigating around people who considered her beneath their notice. While the city's elite toasted to charity, she watched the rhythm of the room, noting the way certain security guards lingered too long near the service entrances, and how the tension in the air seemed to thicken as the clock neared midnight. Nathaniel was at the center of a circle of power, projecting an aura of untouchable authority, yet Valentina saw the way his hand hovered near his waist, a silent testament to the betrayal still fresh in his mind. She drifted toward the perimeter, picking up a stray glass from a table to maintain her cover, when her gaze locked onto a waiter emerging from the kitchen with a tray of crystal flutes. Most people saw a servant, but Valentina saw the way his knuckles were white with tension, and how his grip on the silver tray was unnaturally rigid, as if he were bracing for a recoil rather than a tip. Time seemed to slow into a viscous, terrifying crawl as she watched the waiter's trajectory toward Nathaniel's back, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. No one else noticed the subtle shift in the man's posture, but Valentina's years of survival had taught her to recognize the look of a predator closing in for the kill. She didn't have time to call out over the earpiece or wait for the guards to react. She simply gathered the heavy folds of her silk skirt and launched herself across the polished floor with a desperation that shattered the room's elegant facade. "Nate," she screamed, the name tearing from her throat just as the waiter's hand dipped beneath the white linen cloth covering the tray. She collided with the assassin with the force of a landslide, her shoulder slamming into his chest just as the muffled cough of a suppressed pistol hissed through the air. The impact sent them both crashing into a tower of champagne glasses, the crystal shattering in a spectacular, glittering explosion that drew a collective gasp of horror from the crowd. Valentina felt a searing, white-hot line of agony slice across her upper arm as the bullet grazed her skin, but she didn't let go, clawing at the man's face until Nathaniel's security team swarmed the area like a black tide. In an instant, the assassin was pinned to the floor and the ballroom was plunged into a chaotic symphony of shouting and retreating footsteps. Nathaniel was suddenly there, his face a mask of terrifying, frozen fury as he looked down at the blood blooming across the midnight silk of her sleeve. He reached out, his fingers surprisingly steady as he gripped her uninjured shoulder to pull her up, but the look in his eyes wasn't one of gratitude. It was a dark, unreadable intensity that made her pulse skip a beat. Back inside the darkened sanctuary of the armored SUV, the silence was heavy and suffocating, broken only by the sound of the freezing rain lashing against the reinforced glass. Valentina sat huddled in a wool coat the medic had draped over her, her arm bandaged and throbbing, while Nathaniel stared out into the Chicago night with a jaw so tight it looked carved from granite. He didn't ask if she was in pain. Instead, he poured a glass of amber liquid from the car's bar and downed it in one sharp motion. "You are reckless," he finally said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in the small space. Valentina turned to look at him, her adrenaline beginning to fade into an exhausted, soul-deep chill. "I saved your life, Nathaniel." Again, she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of the night's trauma. He turned his head slowly, his dark, predatory eyes pinning her to the leather seat with a chilling lack of warmth. "And now you're a target for every man who wants me dead," he replied, his tone devoid of any mercy. "Don't think for a second that this makes us even, Valentina. All you've done is make yourself too valuable to lose, and in my world, that's just another way of saying you're a prisoner." The silence of the Corsetti estate was shattered in the early hours of Tuesday morning, not by gunfire or sirens, but by the terrifying, liquid rattle of Mia's lungs struggling for air. Valentina scrambled across the small room, her heart leaping into her throat as she found her daughter's face pale and slick with sweat, her tiny chest heaving in a desperate rhythm that the inhalers couldn't fix. Panic, cold and paralyzing, washed over her while she gathered the limp child into her arms, stumbling toward the hallway with a scream for help dying in her parched throat. She reached the grand staircase, her bandaged arm throbbing in protest, only to find the heavy shadows of the foyer occupied by a man who seemed never to sleep. Nathaniel stood at the foot of the stairs, a glass of scotch in one hand and a burner phone in the other, his gaze snapping to Valentina's frantic form with a speed that suggested he was always braced for a catastrophe. "She can't breathe," Valentina gasped, her voice breaking as she collapsed to her knees on the marble. "Please, the hospital. She's turning blue." Nathaniel didn't hesitate, dropping the glass onto the rug and closing the distance between them in 3 long strides, his coat discarded on the floor as he reached for the child. He didn't waste time with the local emergency services, knowing the bureaucracy of a public Chicago hospital was a death sentence for a girl with Mia's fragile history. Instead, he barked a series of commands into his phone that sounded more like military coordinates than medical requests, his voice a low, vibrating growl of absolute authority. Within 20 minutes, the sound of a private chopper cut through the Chicago fog, and Valentina found herself whisked away to a private wing of the estate where a team of specialists, flown in overnight from Zurich, was already scrubbing in. She watched through the reinforced glass of the medical suite as they stabilized Mia, her eyes blurring with tears while she realized the sheer, terrifying scale of the resources Nathaniel had deployed for a child who wasn't even his blood. Hours later, the sun began to bleed a pale, sickly light over Lake Michigan, and the head specialist emerged to confirm that Mia was finally out of danger, though she would require weeks of intensive monitoring. Valentina was allowed into the room, where she found Nathaniel sitting in a leather chair by the bed, his usually immaculate shirt rumpled and his dark hair falling over his forehead. He was watching Mia sleep with an expression she had never seen on his face, a haunting, quiet vulnerability that suggested he was looking at a ghost of the innocence he had buried decades ago. He didn't look like a monster in that moment, but as the door clicked open to reveal his brother-in-law and top captain, Enzo, the illusion of peace was instantly incinerated. Enzo's face was a mask of simmering resentment as he looked at the medical equipment and the cleaning woman who had somehow breached the inner sanctum of their empire. "The commission is asking why you've grounded the fleet for a maid's brat, Nate," Enzo spat, his voice dripping with a lethal lack of respect that made Valentina's blood run cold. Nathaniel stood up slowly, the softness in his eyes vanishing as if it had never existed, replaced by a cold, predatory vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. He walked toward Enzo until they were chest to chest, his hand coming to rest on the younger man's shoulder in a grip that looked like an embrace, but felt like a strangulation. "My resources go where I command them, Enzo, and right now, my command is that this child lives," Nathaniel whispered, his voice a razor-edged promise of violence. "If the commission has a problem with how I spend my time, tell them to bring it to my front door so I can show them exactly what happens to people who question my family's interests." The rift between the men was visible, a jagged crack in the foundation of the Chicago outfit that Valentina knew was only going to widen. As she sat by Mia's bed, watching the rise and fall of her daughter's chest, she realized that Nathaniel hadn't just saved Mia, He had made her a centerpiece in a power struggle that was about to turn the city red. The cold peace of the recovery wing didn't last long, shattered by a delivery that arrived at the estate's heavy iron gates just as the morning fog began to lift. Valentina was sitting by Mia's bed, watching the steady rhythm of the heart monitor, when the door swung open and Nathaniel entered, his face carved from ice and a small, velvet-lined box in his hand. He didn't say a word, but the way his jaw was set signaled a coming storm that made the air in the room feel thin and electric. He placed the box on the nightstand, and as the lid clicked open, Valentina felt the world tilt on its axis. Rusting on the white silk was a severed finger, the gold wedding band still clinging to the knuckle. She recognized the ring. It was the only thing her father, Ricardo, hadn't pawned during his decades of spiraling into the dark world of underground poker. Silas Vane wasn't just coming for the throne anymore. He was pulling the strings of Valentino's past to force the sovereign of Chicago into a corner. The note accompanying the gruesome trophy was short and devoid of mercy, demanding Nathaniel's surrender at a derelict shipyard in exchange for the gambler's life. Nathaniel let out a short, dry laugh that lacked any trace of humor, his eyes fixed on the wall as if he were already calculating the cost-benefit analysis of a rescue mission. "The man is a ghost of a human being, Valentina," he said, his voice a low, detached rumble that made her heart freeze. "Silas thinks I'm sentimental enough to trade the stability of the outfit for a junkie who sold his daughter's future for a pair of deuces." He turned to leave, his coat billowing behind him like a funeral shroud, but Valentina lunged forward, her fingers digging into the expensive wool of his sleeve with a strength born of pure, unadulterated desperation. She didn't beg for her father's life because she knew Nathaniel didn't value blood. She pleaded for the man who was the only link Mia had left to a world that wasn't stained with gunpowder. "He's a broken man, Nathaniel, but he's the reason I'm here. He's the reason I saved you," she whispered, her voice cracking as the quiet, soul-crushing despair finally broke through her resilient mask. She saw the flick of hesitation in Nathaniel's eyes, a momentary fracture in his diamond-hard resolve that suggested he was warring with himself. He hated the weakness Ricardo represented, yet the sight of Valentina's tears seemed to trigger a dark, possessive hunger in him that overrode the logical advice of his captains. If Silas Vane thought he could use Valentina's trauma as a weapon, Nathaniel was going to show him that the only person allowed to break her was the man who owned her debt. He reached out, his thumb catching a stray tear on her cheek with a touch that was almost tender, yet his gaze remained focused on the carnage to come. He didn't call for a negotiation, he called for a war council. Within the hour, the estate was swarming with men in black tactical gear, the heavy clatter of weapons being loaded echoing through the halls like a drumbeat of doom. Nathaniel stood at the head of the table, his eyes sweeping over his skeptical lieutenants who were still whispering about the maid's brat and the junkie father. He slammed a heavy blade into the mahogany surface, the sound silencing the room instantly as he leaned forward, his voice a lethal promise. "This isn't about a gambler," he growled, his gaze lingering on the door where he knew Valentina was listening. "This is about Silas Vane thinking he can touch what belongs to me and live to tell the tale. We aren't going there to trade. We're going there to burn the very idea of his resistance into ash." As the convoy began to roar to life in the driveway, Valentina watched from the window, realizing that the man she had rescued from the basement was finally going to show the world why they called him the Devil of Chicago. The industrial district of South Chicago felt like a graveyard of rusted steel and broken promises, the air thick with the smell of wet soot and the distant, rhythmic thumping of the lake against the pier. Valentina sat in the back of the armored SUV, her fingers digging into the leather upholstery until the stitching frayed, while she watched the dark silhouette of the warehouse where her father was being held. Nathaniel hadn't allowed her to stay at the estate. He wanted her to witness the price of his protection, forcing her to see the machinery of his wrath in its purest form. Beside her, the dashboard clock ticked toward midnight, a sound that felt like a countdown to an execution, yet the silence outside was even more terrifying. Suddenly, the night was incinerated by a series of controlled explosions that buckled the warehouse's loading doors, followed by the clinical, stuttering chatter of automatic fire that signaled the beginning of the end for Silas Fane's men. Through the reinforced glass, Valentina watched the black-clad figures of the Corsetti squad move with the terrifying precision of a scalpel, cutting through the chaos with a lethality that made her blood run cold. Nathaniel was at the center of the storm, his long overcoat fluttering like the wings of a predatory bird as he moved through the smoke and fire without a hint of hesitation. He didn't look like a man anymore. He looked like a force of nature, a silent devil reclaiming his territory with every shell casing that hit the concrete. Valentina's breath hitched when she saw a figure dragged out of the side entrance, a limp, broken man who looked smaller than she remembered, his gray hair matted with grime and terror. It was Ricardo, her father, looking less like a person and more like a discarded piece of evidence in a crime he never understood. The warehouse behind them erupted into a final, towering pillar of flame as Nathaniel approached the vehicle, the orange glow reflecting in his dark, unreadable eyes. He opened the door, and the scent of gunpowder and ozone flooded the cabin, a suffocating reminder of the violence he had just orchestrated for her sake. He shoved Ricardo into the front passenger seat with a rough, dismissive hand, not looking at the man as he climbed into the back beside Valentina. Nathaniel's knuckles were split, and a splatter of crimson decorated his high-collared shirt, yet his breathing was as steady as a predator at rest. "He's alive, Valentina," Nathaniel said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that lacked any trace of comfort. Valentina reached forward to touch her father's shoulder, her eyes blurring with a mixture of relief and soul-deep exhaustion, but Nathaniel's hand shot out, catching her wrist in a grip that was as firm as an iron shackle. He didn't let go, forcing her to look at him while the driver accelerated away from the burning shipyard, the tires screaming against the asphalt. "But he is no longer your concern," Nathaniel continued, his gaze pinning her to the seat with a terrifying intensity. He leaned forward, speaking to the trembling man in the front seat without ever breaking eye contact with Valentina. "There's a car waiting 2 miles from here with a one-way ticket to California and $10,000. If you ever set foot in Chicago again, Ricardo, if you even think about calling your daughter or looking for your granddaughter, I won't send a doctor. I'll send a shovel." Valentina's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the rescue wasn't an act of mercy. It was a final, brutal amputation of her past. "Nathaniel, please. He's all I have left of my life before this," she whispered, her voice cracking as she looked at her father's slumped back. Nathaniel's grip on her wrist tightened just enough to remind her who owned the air she breathed, his face leaning into the pale light of the passing street lamps. "You don't have a life before this anymore, Valentina," he rasped, his tone devoid of any heat but overflowing with a dark, absolute possessiveness. "The man who raised you is a liability I've just paid off. From this moment on, you and Mia have no father, no grandfather, and no debts to anyone but me." He released her wrist, but the weight of his words remained, a permanent brand upon her soul. As they sped toward the estate, leaving her father on a dark roadside in the middle of nowhere, Valentina realized that she was no longer just a housekeeper or a witness. She was the most precious piece of property in the Corsetti empire, and the devil was never going to let her go. The silence of the Corsetti estate felt different after the warehouse raid, no longer just a symptom of discipline but a heavy, expectant pressure that seemed to follow Valentina through the corridors. She moved like a specter with her feather duster and polish, her presence so thoroughly integrated into the background of the mansion that the men who ruled Chicago began to treat her as little more than a piece of the furniture. It was this invisibility that brought her to the mahogany doors of the library on a Tuesday evening, where the scent of old paper and expensive tobacco usually offered a brief respite from the tension of the household. She had just begun to buff the intricate carvings of a side table when the muffled sound of a voice caught her attention, rising from the small, hidden study tucked behind the main shelves. It wasn't Nathaniel's low, melodic baritone, but the sharp, hurried whisper of Marcus, the man who had served as Nathaniel's primary legal counsel and most trusted advisor for over a decade. Valentina froze, her heart hammering against her ribs as she heard the distinct mention of the New York Commission and a coordinated strike on the Corsetti family's offshore accounts. Marcus was dictating specific coordinates and security passcodes to someone on the other end of a burner phone, his tone devoid of the loyalty he performed so perfectly in the light of day. Valentina's hands shook as she realized she was listening to the blueprint for Nathaniel's total ruin, a betrayal so deep it would leave him vulnerable to the very executioners she had helped him escape. She tried to retreat silently, her soft-soled shoes barely making a sound on the Persian rug, yet a stray floorboard groaned under her weight, echoing through the silent library like a gunshot. The voice on the other side of the shelves stopped instantly, and before Valentina could reach the hallway, Marcus emerged from the shadows, his face a mask of calculated malice as he blocked her exit. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he looked at her with a condescending pity that made her skin crawl. "You're a smart girl, Valentina," he whispered, stepping close enough for her to smell the mint on his breath. "You've seen what happens to people who get caught in the middle of these games. I have $1 million sitting in an untraceable account that says you didn't hear a word of that phone call." The offer was enough to buy her a new life, a way to flee Chicago and find her father. Yet as Valentina looked into the advisor's cold, treacherous eyes, she felt a strange, burning loyalty to the monster who had saved her daughter's life. She didn't respond to the bribe, simply lowering her head and pushing past him with a speed that left him standing in the middle of the library. She didn't go to her room or find Mia. She walked straight to the master wing, past the guards who hesitated to stop her, and burst into Nathaniel's office, where he sat reviewing ledgers in the dim light of a single desk lamp. He looked up, his predatory gaze narrowing as he saw the frantic rise and fall of her chest and the pale terror on her face. Valentina didn't mince words, spilling every detail of the conversation she had overheard, her voice trembling but certain as she named Marcus as the architect of the coming coup. Nathaniel didn't rage. He simply leaned back in his chair, a terrifyingly calm expression settling over his features that was far worse than any display of anger. He pressed a button on his intercom, and within minutes, Marcus was brought into the room by two silent enforcers, his face already turning a sickly shade of gray as he saw Valentina standing beside the sovereign. The advisor began to stammer a denial, but Nathaniel silenced him with a single, slow movement of his hand, reaching into his desk drawer to retrieve a heavy, black semi-automatic pistol. He didn't point it at Marcus. Instead, he stood up and walked around the desk, pressing the cold steel of the grip into Valentina's trembling palm. "You've given me the truth, Valentina," Nathaniel rasped, his hand closing over hers, forcing her fingers to wrap around the weapon as he guided her arm upward until the barrel was leveled directly at Marcus's chest. "In my world, loyalty isn't a feeling, it's a choice made in blood," Nathaniel whispered into her ear, his breath warm against her cheek while the advisor fell to his knees, begging for mercy. The weight of the gun felt like lead in her hand, the metal biting into her skin as she looked down the sights at a man she had considered a fixture of her safety. Nathaniel's grip was unyielding, his body a solid, unwavering wall behind her as he watched her face for any sign of weakness. He tried to buy her silence because he thought you were just a maid. "Show him that you belong to me." Valentina's finger brushed the trigger, the reality of the Corsetti empire finally stripping away the last of her old self. She didn't fire, but the moment the hammer clicked back under Nathaniel's thumb, she realized she had crossed a line she could never go back over. Nathaniel took the gun from her shaking hands, but he didn't look at the traitor. He looked at her with a dark, terrifyingly proud light in his eyes. He had tested her soul, and in the silence of the room, they both knew she was no longer a witness to the violence, she was a part of it. The fallout from Marcus's betrayal left a vacuum of power that the New York Commission was already moving to exploit, their federal informants circling the estate like vultures waiting for a carcass to cool. Nathaniel spent 3 days locked in the war room, the glow of monitors reflecting in his tired eyes as he realized that the legal walls were closing in faster than the physical ones. He emerged on the 4th morning with a solution that felt less like a proposal and more like a tactical deployment, intercepting Valentina as she was tucking Mia into bed. The New York families are pushing for a racketeering investigation, and they flagged you as the primary witness to the basement incident, he said, his voice flat and devoid of any romantic pretense as he leaned against the doorframe. He explained that as a domestic partner, she could invoke spousal privilege, and by legally adopting Mia, he could place the child under the impenetrable shield of the Corsetti name. The math was simple, yet as he looked at her, Valentina saw a flicker of something raw and unscripted beneath his cold logic. "We marry on Saturday. It'll be the largest display of power Chicago has seen in a decade, and it will tell every rat in the city that you're untouchable." The wedding was organized with the same ruthless efficiency as a military raid, turning the estate into a fortress of white roses and black-suited guards. Valentina was draped in hand-stitched lace that cost more than her father's entire gambling debt, her reflection in the mirror looking like a stranger, a queen being prepared for a coronation rather than a bride for a life of love. The ceremony took place in the grand ballroom under the watchful eyes of the city's most dangerous men, many of whom wore smiles that didn't reach their eyes as they toasted to the union of the sovereign and his cleaning girl. Nathaniel held her hand with a grip that was possessive and steady, his wedding band a heavy circle of platinum that felt like a permanent shackle. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the celebration dissolved into a tense, high-stakes gathering where every handshake was a test of loyalty and every glass of champagne was a silent acknowledgement of the new order. By the time they retreated to the master suite, the house was a hum of muffled activity and distant security chatter. The air in the room was thick, charged with the realization that the contract they'd signed in blood was no longer just about debt or survival, it was about a shared destiny. Valentina stood by the window, looking out at the city lights that seemed so far away from the gilded cage she now called home. Nathaniel approached her from behind, his presence a warm, solid weight that seemed to draw the oxygen from her lungs. He didn't touch her at first, merely standing close enough for her to feel the rhythmic thrum of his heart. "You're no longer the girl I found in that basement, Valentina," he murmured, his voice a low, dark vibration against the back of her neck. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a gentleness that was far more terrifying than his rage. "You're the only person who hasn't tried to sell me out for a price. That makes you the most dangerous thing in this room." Valentina turned to face him, the silk of her dress rustling in the silence. She looked into the eyes of the man who had destroyed her past and realized that she no longer felt the urge to run back to the life she had lost. The fear that had defined her for years was being replaced by a cold, sharp ambition, a realization that she was the only one who could truly see the man behind the monster. She reached up, her hand resting against his chest, feeling the power that radiated from him. "I didn't choose this life because I was afraid, Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice steady and echoing the hardness of the world they occupied. "I chose it because I realized the only way to protect Mia is to be the one who controls the shadows." In that moment, the line between victim and partner finally vanished. The basement covenant had evolved into something far more permanent, and as the sovereign pulled his queen into the darkness of the room, Valentina knew she wasn't just surviving the empire anymore, she was preparing to roll it. The honeymoon period of the Corsetti union lasted exactly 4 hours before the world outside the estate's limestone walls dissolved into a symphony of violence. The master suite was still dim, lit only by the flickering embers in the fireplace, when the heavy thrum of the emergency generators died, plunging the fortress into a vacuum of absolute, predatory darkness. Valentina's heart didn't just race, it hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as the distinct, rhythmic rattle of suppressed gunfire erupted from the south gardens, followed by the shattering of the high-tensile glass in the grand foyer. Silas Vane hadn't waited for the politics of New York to settle the score. He launched a scorched-earth invasion while the household was still reeling from the wedding festivities. Nathaniel was out of bed before the first alarm could sound, his movements a blur of lethal instinct as he reached for the tactical radio on the nightstand. Yet the static screaming back at him confirmed that the external security perimeter had been decimated. "Stay behind me," he growled, his voice a low vibration that anchored Valentina's panic. But as he moved toward the heavy oak door, a hail of bullets ripped through the wood, sending splinters of history flying like shrapnel through the air. A grunt of pain escaped Nathaniel's throat as he slumped against the doorframe, crimson blooming across the white silk of his pajama top where a stray round had found his shoulder. Valentina didn't scream. The years of surviving on the edge of poverty had conditioned her for the worst, and the sight of her husband bleeding on their wedding night triggered a cold, industrial clarity in her mind. She lunged forward, catching his weight before he could hit the floor, while the sound of boots thundering up the main staircase grew closer. The main halls were a killing field, but Valentina knew the geometry of this house better than the architects who built it, having spent months memorizing every service panel and laundry vent while she scrubbed the floors. She dragged Nathaniel toward the walk-in closet, her fingers fumbling for the hidden latch behind the cedar shelving that led to the invisible network of maintenance tunnels. "Mia," she hissed, her voice a desperate thread of sound as she pulled her daughter from the hidden alcove where the girl had been hiding since the first shot. The tunnels were cramped, smelling of dust and ancient insulation, but they provided the only safe passage through the heart of the siege. Valentina hauled Nathaniel through the narrow passage, his breathing a ragged, wet whistle as the blood loss began to sap his formidable strength. They moved like ghosts beneath the feet of the invaders, hearing the muffled shouts of Silas Vane's men as they ransacked the master suite directly above. Valentina led them toward the reinforced bunker of the command center, a room buried deep beneath the estate's foundation that served as the brain of the Corsetti empire. They burst through the final hatch just as the main monitors flickered to life on backup battery power, revealing a green-tinted nightmare of the courtyard filled with black-clad mercenaries. Nathaniel collapsed into the central chair, his face a ghostly shade of gray, yet his fingers danced across the console with a terrifying focus as he began to coordinate the counterstrike from his loyalists still in the city. The heavy steel door of the bunker shuddered under the impact of a breaching charge, the vibrations rattling Valentina's teeth, while Mia whimpered in the corner, her small hands over her ears. Nathaniel looked up from the screen, his gaze landing on the tactical shotgun leaning against the server rack, and then on his wife, who was already reaching for it. There was no hesitation in her eyes, only a jagged, obsidian resolve that mirrored his own. She racked the slide with a metallic clack that sounded like a final judgment, her feet planted firmly in front of the door that stood between her family and the men who wanted to end their legacy. "They're coming through, Nate," she whispered, her voice as steady as the winter wind, while she leveled the barrel at the center of the steel plating. Nathaniel's hand reached out, his bloody fingers brushing her ankle in a silent acknowledgement of the woman she had become. He was the strategist, the mind of the operation currently turning the tide on the grounds, but she was the shield, the last line of defense in the sovereign's inner sanctum. As the door finally buckled and the first flashbang detonated, Valentina didn't flinch. She pulled the trigger, the roar of the weapon echoing through the bunker as she finally accepted that the queen of a mafia empire didn't just wear lace. She wore the blood of those who tried to take what was hers. The smoke from the siege still hung heavy over the estate, But the air in the basement of the Black Diamond Casino was colder, stagnant with the scent of iron and damp concrete. It was a grotesque echo of the night they first met, yet the roles had shifted into a configuration that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Silas Vane was no longer the arrogant architect of a coup. He was a broken, bloodied heap of a man chained to the very same industrial pipe where Nathaniel had once faced his end. The flickering overhead light cast jagged shadows across his swollen face, while the rhythmic drip of water from a leaky valve measured the final seconds of his life. Nathaniel stood in the center of the room, his arm in a sling, but his presence as suffocating as a physical weight, his dark eyes never leaving the man who had tried to incinerate his legacy. He didn't look at his lieutenants or the guards standing in the shadows. He looked only at Valentina, who stood beside him with a face that had finally hardened into the same diamond-edged resolve that ruled the Chicago outfit. Nathaniel reached into the small of his back and pulled his custom semi-automatic, the matte black finish catching the pale light as he held it out to her, grip first. "He's the reason your father is in exile, Valentina," Nathaniel murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "He's the reason Mia almost stopped breathing, and the reason our home is currently a graveyard of glass and shell casings." He stepped closer, his heat radiating through the silk of her dress as he pressed the cold weight of the weapon into her hand. "The outfit expects blood for blood, and the Sovereign's queen shouldn't have to wait for others to settle her debts. Take the shot." The room went silent, the tension so thick it felt like it might shatter the reinforced walls, yet Valentina didn't move her finger to the trigger. She looked at Silas, whose eyes were wide with a pathetic, guttering fear, and she felt a strange, detached clarity that transcended the need for vengeance. She didn't lower the weapon immediately, holding it with a steady, practiced grip that made the gathered captains whisper in the shadows. She looked Silas in the eye, not with the fury he expected, but with a chilling, clinical indifference that was far more damaging to a man who lived for power. "If I kill you, Silas, then you become the foundation of who I am in this world," she said, her voice echoing with a haunting, bell-like resonance. "You be the ghost that follows me every time I look at my daughter or sit at Nathaniel's table, and I won't give you that much importance." She turned the weapon over and handed it back to Nathaniel, her gaze never flickering as she stepped back into the darkness. "I survived the basement as a girl who cleaned your filth. I'm not going to let your death be the first thing I do as a woman who rolls it. He isn't a trophy, Nathaniel. He's just garbage that needs to be taken out." The silence that followed was absolute, a moment where the hierarchy of the Chicago underworld shifted on its axis. Nathaniel looked at the gun in his hand and then at the woman who had just displayed a level of psychological dominance that few men in his circle could even comprehend. A slow, dark smile touched his lips, a look of newfound, terrifying respect that bordered on worship. He realized then that she wasn't just his partner or his shield. She was the conscience of his empire, the one who understood that true power wasn't in the act of killing, but in the choice of who was worthy of the bullet. Without a word, Nathaniel turned and fired 3 times into Silas's chest, the reports deafening in the small space, but his eyes never left Valentina's face. As the body slumped into the shadows, Nathaniel reached out and took her hand, his bloody knuckles brushing hers in a silent covenant. They left the basement together, leaving the past to rot in the dark, while the men behind them realized that the Sovereign was no longer a single man, he was a dynasty. The smell of ash and expensive cologne hung in the air of the master study as the first light of a new Chicago dawn bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows. On the mahogany desk sat a weathered, yellowing folder, the ledger of the Mendez debt that had once been the iron collar around Valentina's neck. Nathaniel didn't say a word as he struck a silver lighter, the flame dancing in his dark eyes before he touched it to the corner of the paper. They watched together as the ink that had signed away her freedom curled and blackened, the smoke rising in a thin, disappearing ribbon that signaled the end of an era. "The debt is gone," Valentina, Nathaniel murmured, his voice sounding weary yet strangely at peace as he slid a cashier's check for $5 million across the desk toward her. There's a car waiting at the gate to take you and Mia wherever you want to go. You can have the quiet life you dreamed of, far away from the blood and the shadows of the city. He stood by the window, his back to her, offering the one thing he had never given anyone else, a choice. Valentina looked at the check and then at the broad, scarred shoulders of the man who had become her world's sun and its darkest eclipse. She thought of the basement, the laundry chutes, and the way her hands had felt holding a shotgun to protect the empire they had bled for together. The quiet life felt like a ghost story now, a dream belonging to a girl who no longer existed, replaced by a woman who had found her strength in the heart of a storm. She walked over to him, her silk heels silent on the rug, and slowly tore the check into a dozen white fragments that fell like snow at his feet. "I didn't stay this long just to run when the air got clear, Nathaniel," she whispered, reaching out to turn him toward her, her touch certain and devoid of fear. "Mia has a father who would move mountains for her, and I have a kingdom that I helped build from the floor up. We aren't leaving." Nathaniel's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek with a reverence that proved the monster had finally found its match. The Black Diamond Casino reopened a month later, but the gold-leafed halls felt different under the gaze of the new first lady of the outfit. The gambling den where Valentina once scrubbed floors was now the beating heart of a legitimate business empire, a place where the shadows were managed with a grace that only someone who had lived in them could provide. As she stood on the mezzanine, watching Mia play in the private gardens below, Valentina realized that her life hadn't been a tragedy, but a transformation. She had walked into the dark to save a stranger and emerged as the light that guided him, proving that even the most ruthless hearts can be tethered by a loyalty that isn't bought, but earned. The blood was washed away, the debts were retired, and for the first time in her life, the girl who was once a ghost was finally, truly seen. This journey reminds us that life often hides our greatest strengths behind our deepest fears. We think we're just surviving the day, scrubbing away at the messes others leave behind, but every trial is just preparing us for a throne we haven't claimed yet. Here at Sunni Romance, we believe that love isn't always about finding someone who keeps you safe. It's about finding the person who makes you feel powerful enough to face the world together. Valentina started as a victim of circumstances, but ended as the architect of her own destiny, showing us that kindness and resilience can turn even a monster into a protector. It makes you wonder about your own life, doesn't it? Have you ever had a moment where a single choice, a single act of bravery, changed the entire course of your future? Let us know in the comments if you've ever found strength in a place you never expected. Thank you for walking this dark and beautiful path with us, and we'll see you in the next story.